jumping on in. What does it feel like for you? Because listen, when you made this movie, you don't really know if people are going to respond to it. You don't know if it's going to be like people are going to enjoy it. You don't know anything. So what does it actually mean to you to have so many people loving this movie? And I hate using Rotten Tomatoes, but I checked and it's like 150 something reviews, movies at like 95% positive. I mean, that's a very high number.
I think it's my highest rated movie, maybe. Well, listen, I mean, of all the movies I've made, like, it's the only one because it's about kind of like another subject. I kind of think like you'd be churlish not to enjoy it, like, because they're so entertaining and their work is so entertaining. So I'm happy that people are enjoying it, but I did set out to make a film that was as much an introduction as a celebration. That was key to it, is because I didn't want it to be like for Sparks fans only. I wanted to sort of introduce them to people who maybe had missed them, or to people who knew a little bit about Sparks but didn't have a lot of other context. So for it to sort of go down well with all three of those camps means a lot to me. But, you know, and also it's something where, you know, like, I mean, the thing is like using the word passion project or labor of love. The truth is every movie should be a passion project or a labor of love. But this, you know, and Soho, both of them in different ways. But this is something where I've liked Ron and Russell and Sparks for many, many years. I've always felt like more people should know who they were or understand how influential they were and how many artists have been influenced by them. And so making the film was like the best way of doing that. So I made the movie because as a Sparks fan, I was aggrieved on their behalf that they weren't better known.
You showed the movie, you premiered at Sundance. After the Sundance premiere, did you make any tweaks or changes based on what people said, or is the version that everyone watched the same cut?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I could even contemplate like going back into the edit. No, it's the same version. Like, the thing we showed at Sundance is that's it. Yeah.
This is your first documentary. What did you learn making this that you would apply if you were to actually make another documentary?
That's a good question. I think, you know, I have obviously a better understanding of what goes into it. And I don't know. I think sort of like, you know, I would be like, it wasn't that I was necessarily nervous doing it, but like, I definitely have a better understanding of what it takes and how long it takes. And, you know, I think it was like slightly different in terms of like how I do the fiction films, where I'm really like hands-on and like standing over people's shoulders, in the sense of, you know, when me and Paul Matchless edit the other movies, we're in the room the whole time. We do it, you know, like he edits, but we're in the room the whole time. But with this, like with Paul True Arthur editing, it was actually useful for both of us, for me to kind of like watch a cut frequently, or watch cuts of little pieces, because the way of getting through something like this, where there's like hundreds of hours of archive and hundreds of hours of interviews, is that I'd seen all the archive, I'd done the interviews, and then I have a pretty good memory in that I'd done all the interviews myself. And even though there were transcripts of the interviews, I didn't really need to read them, and I didn't rewatch the footage of the interviews because I just kind of had it in my head who said what. So then if Paul True Arthur would edit something together, then, you know, a lot of it would be this back and forth, especially in lockdown. We got the sort of the lion's share of the work done in the first lockdown, where we couldn't be in the same room. But in a weird way, that was beneficial, because I could watch something, give a bunch of notes, speak on the phone, and he would go away and do it. Sometimes he would send me back a cut the same day. So it was this constant like ping pong. And usually I'd watch a cut and I'd say, hey, didn't Neil Gaiman say something about this? Hey, check like Mark Gattis's interview again. I think he said something about this. Oh, you know what? If you're going to use, instead of that clip, I'd rather, if that's all we're going to see of that, let's just use this clip. Or so it was just something where it was a really different way of working from like my other movies, and I think also a really good way of working, where it's just an ongoing process. You know, like keep looking for bits of like archive. Sometimes things would still kind of show up very late in the day, and you could incorporate them. So that was sort of amazing, like as a great way of making it. And then even like at the end of it, we had this concert, and it was like, well, we have this whole concert. Let's finish this off as well, because this is like the greatest DVD extra of all time, like a 90-minute concert. So the final thing we did, like quite long after the fact, is I asked Paul Arthur, I said, let's kind of like give this kind of a bit of shape, and sort of, so it can't just kind of like disappear. We have this amazing kind of asset, and we should like finish this as a feature in its own right.
The movie is about 2 hours and 20 minutes. What was the cut that you had above that you're like, I don't know how we're getting this any shorter?
Well, I think the assemble edit that I watched was like 9 hours long. And then the next...
I got to pause there. That is the longest assemble edit anyone has ever told me, in terms of, you know, like sometimes I hear like, you know, directors talking about their assembly cut was 3 hours or 3.5 hours. I've never heard 9 hours.
Well, I mean, there was like hundreds of hours of interviews,
sure,
I imagine. And also like kind of like more than 50 years to cover. I think then I watched like I watched like a 4-hour cut, which is one that you could watch in kind of one sitting. But, you know, the thing is that with this is like, yeah, if you were making like a Beatles film or Bob Dylan, artists who were like massive, then you could go to like a, you know, an HBO and saying, we want to show this in 2 parts, like No Direction Home. But because it was Sparks, it's like sort of like, we need people to kind of watch this in one hit. So it needs to be a feature. So we all knew that that's what we was aiming for, is to make something that you could watch as a feature in one sitting. So, and also, to be perfectly frank, I don't think we could have afforded to clear all of the archive for a 4-hour version. So when people say, when I mention that in interviews, they say, when are we going to get to see the 4-hour version? It's like, I think never, because like you can't afford, it's so much work and so much expense to clear archive that like we just wouldn't have been able to do it. That said, on the kind of the Blu-ray, we did put a lot of the other footage on there. There's a lot of great stuff that's on the Blu-ray, because there was something where I did this slightly different approach when I was shooting, which I had Ron and Russell revisiting locations, and they were really sweet. And it was sort of the kind of thing you might see in a sort of BBC documentary. Like there was a great Alan Yentob documentary about the Kinks, where he just took Ray Davis around their first concert venue and interviewed him. And I did some things where I took Ron and Russell to previous locations, and they were really sweet and interesting things. But as soon as we started editing the documentary, that oral history, like momentum of having hundreds of talking heads talking about the history of Sparks, you couldn't then just slow down and do this little vignette of like going back to the beach or going back to their mum's shop. So those things kind of hit the cutting room floor pretty early, but it's like, save these, like, because it's like they don't fit in the feature, but we should save these as little vignettes. So we put those all on the Blu-ray, and they're, you know, nice little kind of shorts in their own right.
When you are interviewing someone, so say you're bringing in Neil Gaiman, Mike Myers, all the people you had, when you interview them, from the moment they sit down, do you sort of have an understanding, like whatever they say you can use? Or how does it work in terms of, do you then send them the footage and say, I want to use this, this, and this? Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I mean, people are coming to talk about Sparks. It's not like you're doing a career thing about them. Like, and if there's something that they said on camera that, you know, I mean, say, hey, don't use that bit. But no, you know, people sign a release and they're here to talk about Sparks. So it didn't have to kind of like sort of clear stuff with people, you know.
Sure. Well, I'm specifically wondering, I really enjoyed the little bits of Mike Myers in the movie. And there's a bit where he like makes a joke about his mole and like the 3/4 lens. And I'm like, did he have to clear that with Mike? You know, like,
I think maybe I did clear that one with Mike, actually, sort of like he's the one person that I did show him some bits just to make sure he was cool with it. And to his credit, he was cool with it. He's got a sense of humor, obviously.
Right. Is it true or not true that you made this documentary purely to interview Mike Myers?
No, that's not true. But I love Mike, and it's funny. We've been like friends for a few years now, and like sort of, and he was like obviously helped me out with Baby Driver. Like he gave me the permission to use the Austin Powers mask. So I've known Mike for a little bit. So it's actually nice to kind of actually do something with him, you know? And bizarrely enough, like I didn't see Ron and Russell for the whole of the press in the US because of COVID. I was stuck in London, you know, Sundance was virtual, South by Southwest was virtual. We did like 1 million Zooms together. And then the one place that we were going to be together to do press was London. And we were going to do like we did a Q&A, and the one in-person Q&A with the three of us was in Sundance, London. And that the night before we went to like a restaurant in London, in Marylebone, a restaurant where we were sitting outside, and I was sitting with Ron and Russ, and it was like the first dinner I'd had with them since the last time I'd seen them in person. And then as we were having dinner, like Russell went, oh, and looked behind, and standing behind, waiting to be recognized, was Mike Myers. He just happened to be staying in the hotel where the restaurant was, and just and said, yes, I heard your voice. And he'd never met Sparks before. So I introduced Ron and Russell to Mike Myers, and Paul Myers, his brother, was there as well. So I got a photo of like the five of us, which was just complete coincidence. What are the chances of the first time I've had dinner with Ron and Russell in over 2 years that Mike Myers happens to walk by?
What is you've obviously traveled the world. What's the craziest place you've run into somebody that you know, like the most unexpected place?
Oh my God, you're asking some good questions today that I don't have answers for. That's a really,
you know what I mean? Like you're in the middle of like Ireland on the countryside and you run into your childhood best friend. You know, obviously this is hypothetical.
I wish I had a good story about this. I have a good story about somebody else. I have the best version of the story. I can tell you that instead. Edward Woodward, who's in Hot Fuzz, is in Australia. I guess it's when he's shooting that film Breaker Morant, and he's hiking with his wife. And this other guy is walking towards them. And in Australia, you can see somebody coming a mile off. And this guy comes up to him and says, holds out his hand and says, Edward Woodward. And Edward Woodward says, oh, yeah, nice to meet you. And he goes, what's your name? And he goes, I'm Edward Woodward. He introduced himself as Edward Woodward to another Edward Woodward. So he wasn't coming up to say, you're Edward Woodward. He was introducing himself, I'm Edward Woodward. And he goes, that's my name. So what are the chances in Australia in the outback of two Edward Woodwards meeting? I don't have a story as good as that one. So, I mean, if it comes to me later, I'll email you.
Yeah. I definitely would not have expected that story out. Running into anyone in Australia in the outback the thing is huge.
I tell you, no, I know, I do have a good story actually. When I was making Hot Fuzz, so flashback, so when I was a teenager and I first was making films, and amateur films, I was working in a supermarket as my Saturday job. And because I'd been in the local paper, because I'd won a competition on TV, so I was in the local paper, and there was another stocker who was in my brother's year at the supermarket, and his joke, once I was working, you know, it was my Saturday job, I was working in a supermarket, but I was like, had these amateur films and stuff. And this guy, Darren Curtis, his joke to me all the time is I'd be like, you know, stacking like cereals, and he'd come up behind me and goes, excuse me, are you the famous director, Edgar Wright? Like that was his joke. Whenever I was like doing some sort of like job, and that was his running joke, to come up to me in the supermarket saying, excuse me, are you the famous director, Edgar Wright? So this is like in like 1994, maybe not 1991, 92. Cut to 2006. I'm shooting Hot Fuzz, and we're doing a night shoot in the street with Simon and Nick. And I'm back in my hometown, like doing the film. And I have not seen this guy since. And then tap, tap, tap on my shoulder. The same guy, Darren Curtis, goes, excuse me, are you the famous shelf stacker, Edgar Wright? It was like he'd waited 15 years for the payoff of that joke. That's my story.
Also, that's a great story. That's just great.
Shout out to Darren Curtis if you're listening.
That is great. So when we spoke last time with Ron and Russell, I mentioned, did you make this doc so you could hear the music of My the Psychic Girl because you had not heard it?
Well, you know what? After you mentioned that in the last interview, I did mention it to them and they said they have it, but I mean, I'm actually seeing them tonight. I haven't been in Los Angeles, you know, so I think I'm not, you know, so at a point where I could go over to their house, I think I'd like to listen to it with them. So yes, there is a possibility, but I still have not heard it yet.
Do you think, because obviously they
as far as I know as well, it hasn't been repurposed for other stuff either, because that sometimes happens. I think whatever they wrote for the musical still exists and they didn't like use it for anything else.
They had, as you point out in the doc, they had a number of years in the early 90s where they were working all the time, but not actually on an album, you know, not on a record deal. So do you think that they have, like in the doc, they talk about how they've written 850 songs. I forget the exact number. But do you think they have like hundreds of songs or like 100 songs they've never released? Have you spoken to them about that?
I'm sure there is a lot of stuff that they haven't released because I don't think it's something where they look back. Like, I know that like after they did the album Balls in like 2000, they had written another album and they junked it and did Little Beethoven instead. And so I know that there's sometimes that they've written an album and said, hey, we should be doing something different. Let's kind of get rid of this. So I'm sure there is a lot of stuff because I think in that period they kept on writing, but I think it's something where they just have an internal momentum where they can't stop creating. Like, I know that even like this year, in between doing like the press for this and Net and getting ready to tour, I know that they've already written the next album, you know, like, so I think they just don't stop. I think, and that's one of the things that is astonishing about them is I think that because they're in their 70s, but one of the things that I think has kept them going is they've never looked down on the pop song as an art form. Like some kind of like bands who are maybe, or artists who sort of like get older, sort of like feel like their kind of like previous work is like beneath them, or just the idea of doing like 4-minute songs is somehow kind of like simplistic and they should be beyond that. But I think Ron and Russell, I think what keeps them going is they're always trying to write the perfect spark song or even the perfect pop song. Of course, along the way, they've written hundreds of perfect spark songs, but I think it's the thing that keeps them going is that this quest to make music and make the perfect sparks pop song is like never ending.
Yeah, I mean, there's not too many bands that have written that many songs. I mean, that it's just a huge number. I do wonder though if at some point they're going to be like, okay, so we're retiring and here's 600 songs you've never heard. You know?
Well, I mean, I guess like, you know, like Prince was like that. Like there's, you know, obviously like we're starting to hear some of the stuff from the vaults that, you know, I mean, it's an interesting thing because I think sort of like some people are just prolific like that. They can't stop creating. And, you know, but then there are factors that come into it where, you know, I think there was a point with kind of Prince where him and Warner Brothers fell out is because he was being overproductive. And they were saying like, oh, we don't need like 2 double albums a year, which is where they kind of, I think, came to sort of blows eventually. But some people kind of like just can't turn the tap off. You know, they just keep creating. And it's a fascinating part of what Ron and Russell do that, like, you know, Sparks is like a 9-to-5 job for them.
Oh, 100%. Believe me, I've learned everything about them from the doc. I was going to make a joke, but one of the things that I really love about the doc,
maybe 10 to 6, not 9 to 5.
Right, exactly. They have to go jogging in the morning first.
Yeah. I think it literally is like 10:30 till 6.
One of the things that I love about the doc is the way you interweave the animated sequences, the claymation, the way you tell the story using animation. How difficult was it to include that stuff, to get it into the doc, and where did the idea come from in terms of using animation?
Well, they've done some animated videos in their time, And in fact, there was a really great one only a couple of years ago for the song Edith Piaf Said It Better Than Me that Joseph Wallace did, where he did a stop motion animation video with a stop puppet Ronald Russell. And the first bit of filming I did for the movie was the concert. I shot their concert in like Kentish Town Forum in 2018. And Joseph came to the gig, the animator, and he brought the puppets with him. And I was like, these have to be in the documentary. So that was like the start of it. And then there was a couple of animators, but Joseph Wallace was the key one doing all the stop motion stuff. And then we brought in another guy, Greg McLeod, who had done this amazing bit of animation for Adam Buxton. If you look it up online, just look up the Tony Visconti, David Bowie, Brian Eno sketch by Adam Buxton. It's just a hilarious bit of animation. So I basically, obviously as well, there are things within the archive where, I mean, there are stories told in the documentary where there is no archive. And I just felt, because we had so much other great historical archive, that it'd be great to show animation for bits where there just was none. And then also just because Ron and Russell are so visual and, you know, have a background, not just in filmmaking, because Russell studied at UCLA, but Ron studied graphic design. And it's been a big part of obviously their album covers are like such a huge part of what they do. It just seemed like a no-brainer to sort of and to incorporate lots of different styles of animation, cutout, stop motion, claymation, traditional line drawing, like a little manga sequence. You know, that sequence was done by some of the animators from Scott Pilgrim. It's like literally one bit where it's like, hey, we don't have any footage for the My the Psychic Girl project collapsing. Why don't we get some artists to do a manga strip for that?
Yeah, and by the way, it looks, listen, man, you know I love this movie. My last thing, because I think I'm basically out of time, I don't think people realize the importance of clearance and like clearance issues in terms of making a documentary. And I'm just curious, were there things that you wanted to include that you ran into, we can't clear this, like there's rights issues?
Not really. No, more the thing is like there were a couple, I mean, listen, the truth is that the clearance and the archive and the music is like a Herculean task, like just mind-boggling. And like Kate Griffiths, who was the sort of archive producer, and also Laura Richardson, who was one of the producers on the movie, and the whole team just did so much work right up until the release of the film, like dotting the I's and crossing the T's. And that's why you'll never see a 4-hour cut. It's just like, that is so much work. Anybody who's made a documentary with archive knows what an incredible amount of work it is, because they're coming from all over the world, those clips. It wasn't so much the clips. There were some things that we just could not find. There were a couple of like key TV appearances in like America and the UK that had long been wiped, and we were sort of maybe hoping that, you never know, somebody might find something in their attic. But there was a couple of like sort of, I mean, luckily there's so much other stuff, but I was maybe thinking like, you know, like a key TV appearance, like their first American Bandstand appearance, or their first appearance on this show called The Old Grey Whistle Test, that they might show up in the process. But, you know, sometimes those things are just gone. I mean, that's the thing that people like just don't, didn't understand back then, is the value of like keeping everything, you know. Lots of these TV companies said, hey, we haven't got room for these 1/4-inch tapes, let's wipe it.
I think about all the Johnny Carson episodes that are just gone.
There's tons of like, the BBC used to have a policy, which is now thankfully gone, where they were trying to kind of like save space in the archive. So they decided with some comedy shows to keep the first and the last episodes and wipe the rest. And it happened, and some shows like Monty Python's Flying Circus, luckily, because they've been sold to other countries, all of those exist. There are Doctor Who episodes that got wiped. There are many, many episodes of Top of the Pops that got wiped. You know, Peter Cook and Dudley Moore's show, not only, but also there were 3 seasons of it, and there's only like 6 episodes that remain, which is like a crime against comedy, you know?
Completely. Listen, I got to stop there, but I am going to say it again. This doc is one of my favorite films of the year. I mean, I can't say enough good things about it, man. And, I'm glad so many people love it like me. And thank you for your time.